It's great to be back. I used to come to Melbourne quite a bit on business when I worked for Microsoft, and I will say it's much more fun coming back here as an author and a philanthropist and a builder of libraries. I'm really excited. Chantel from my team for the last probably month has been sending me regular updates on the RSVP count. And at first it was, John, there's 100 people coming, and there's 120 signed up, and 150 signed up, and I didn't really know if Room to Read was as well known in Melbourne as we thought we were. So it's really heartening for me to be here and to see such a large crowd tonight. So first of all, thank you for coming out. Secondly, wow, I never thought I'd write one book. I'm really psyched the second book is out. I think if any of you, how many of you have written or published a book or made that crazy attempt? It's kind of, you spend 4 years in the cave, and then finally you emerge from the cave and you get to this crazy thing called book tour. And it's really great because you've spent so much time inwardly focused, like, in a, darkened second bedroom or on an airplane with your headphones on, writing. And after 4 years, the final product finally emerges and you get to go out and talk about it. So it's really exciting to be on book tour. We're in week 7 now. We released the book February 7th in the States. And we have been in Canada, a couple cities, and Hong Kong and Singapore, and now both Sydney and Melbourne. And if you have friends in Sydney, please let them know we'll be at Burklow Books in Paddington on Saturday at 1 p.m. Tomorrow night's event, thankfully, at Burklow is like tonight, sold out and standing room only. And so we've added a second session. So if you have friends in Sydney, please let them know. Finally, if you're tweeting, I'm sure that in this audience, only a few of you are tweeting, because most of you are probably, hopefully, going to pay close attention. But I am John Wood, RTR. The RTR is, of course, standing for Room to Read. So finally, I just want to say it's really great to be here at the Wheele Centr, because sometimes life comes full circle. And it was with a Lonely Planet Guide to the Nepalese Himalayas in my backpack in 1998, written by Stan Armington, that I set out for my first trip to Nepal. And it was a year later, in 1999, with that same now dog-eared copy of the Lonely Planet Guide, that I went back to Nepal to deliver that first load of books to the little village of Bahundanda. And for me, it's wonderful when life comes full circle. When we first met with the people from the Wheeler Foundation a couple of years ago, we proposed to them that your book helped to create Room to Read. Room to Read now creates books in the mother tongue of children throughout the developing world. And why not have the Wheeler Foundation also do some funding of local language books? And so when those first Wheeler Foundation funded books rolled off the press, especially in the Nepalese language, it was another moment for me of the power of people who love to travel, the people who love literature, the people who love books, and the people who love doing good things for the world, being able to all come together in a very serendipitous manner. So it's great to be back here and to once again be connected with the Wheeler family and indeed the Wheeler dynasty of a better life and a better planet through travel. So the first question I've gotten from people, I wrote this first book, Leaving Microsoft to Change the World, and it was released in 2006. And the main reason I wrote the first book was because, I'll be really honest, my mother told me I had to write a book, because my mother was enamored of my story. And at Microsoft, we used to have this thing, whenever somebody proposed a really stupid idea, somebody would say, "That's a great idea. You'll sell dozens." And you can use that at your next business meeting. And so I kind of thought, that's a great idea, Mom. Nobody knows who I am or knows who Room to Read is. And thankfully, she was right. It set off this very beautiful snowball or avalanche of support for Room to Read around the world. Of people who had traveled through post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia would travel with the book and say, Room to Read's building libraries in Cambodia, building schools. I should get involved in this. Or people who traveled in Vietnam saying, I should start a chapter in Perth or in London or in Zurich and all these other cities. So the first book, I think, for us became, Leaving Microsoft, published just 7 years ago, very quickly became obsolete. If anybody's read it, they may remember the final chapter of Leaving Microsoft is titled The Millionth Book. And it was all about this magical day in Nepal. We were doing a ceremony to recognize the fact that what started with 3,000 books on the back of 6 rented donkeys had now scaled way beyond my wildest dreams, and we're distributing our 1 millionth book. The good news is that that book set off such a wave of support for us around the world that book became really obsolete. And we went to 2 million books and 3 million books and 4 million books. And the more people got involved, the more we put their time to work, their money to work, their talents to work, and we kept growing and growing and growing. So what happened is Leaving Microsoft became this kind of historical footnote of what we were all about because the organization was growing and evolving so quickly. 1 millionth book As the end of that book, we're now today, I'm proud to say, at 12.5 million books distributed to kids all across 10 countries of Asia and Africa. And if you think about the power of one book to change a life, and then think about the power of 12.5 million books out to change the world, it's fairly substantial. It's also humbling because we have a long, long ways to go. There's too many kids in the world today who don't have and who really need what we provide. There's too many girls who don't go to school. There's too many young boys who don't know how to read. The numbers, I think many of you probably will know them, are fairly staggering. This morning, 200 million children across the developing world woke up and did not go to school. Think about that. What is that, 7x the population of Australia? Did not go to school this morning. 780 million people in the developing world today are illiterate. 98% of those in the world who are illiterate are still in the developing world. They are the victims of what Mr. Pasupati Neopani, my first guide to see the school in Nepal, said to me when he said, in Nepal, we are too poor to afford education. He said this, of course, as he was showing me a completely empty library. We are too poor to afford education. But, he said forlornly, until we have education, we are always going to remain poor. And that, to me, is just the cruelest thing, this whole catch-22, this whole paradox. And any child can be told at age 4 or 5 or 6, you were born in the wrong place at the wrong time to the wrong family, and you therefore are not going to get educated. We think that idea belongs in a scrap heap of history. We think that well-meaning people like yourself, like myself, like my team, like our amazing Melbourne chapter who's here tonight in the back of the room, that we can make that whole notion a historical footnote in the same way that apartheid and slavery and a lot of diseases that no longer exist, those were created, those were solved by worldwide movements, and we're hoping to do that. So since the first book came out, let me just give you a quick highlight of the scale. And many of you in this room have helped us to reach this scale. When the first book came out, we had opened 450 schools, which was way beyond what I ever thought possible. Today we've opened 1,650 schools. When the last book came out, we had opened about 4,000 libraries. Today, I'm proud to say we've opened over 15,000 libraries across the developing world. My hero, Andrew Carnegie, late in his life, he waited a little too late to redeem himself, I think, but late in his life, Carnegie turned his good fortune to building libraries because he said being poor should not be a barrier to education. And he opened 2,500 libraries in his lifetime that to this day pay dividends generation after generation after generation for tens of millions of people. Well, we've honored Carnegie by out-Carnegieing him. We've opened 6x the number of libraries as Andrew Carnegie. And this shows that you don't have to be a billionaire to change the world. You don't have to be a celebrity. You don't have to be an old white guy who's like 75 years old with a white beard like Carnegie is. It's just average people like ourselves can create absolutely huge, huge, huge systemic change. So let me talk a little bit about this book. I do want to tell those of you who need to get out of here in a hurry and don't want to wait for a signature, at Room to Read we're very efficient, so we've already autographed about 60 copies in the back, so there will be an express lane, because I go to readings and sometimes there's nothing worse than waiting for the author and then the person in line in front of you is telling the author their life story and, oh, let me tell you about my granddaughter, she was a volunteer in Mongolia, and you're like, come on man, I got dinner plans. So there are a bunch of books pre-signed in the back. So why write a second book? Isn't that kind of a hubristic act? Like you've written one memoir, you're still relatively young. Why write a second book? And for me, really the main reason was that I think the first book, Leaving Microsoft, was really a story where I used first-person singular quite a bit. I met a headmaster in Nepal. I saw an empty library. I found my passion. I quit my job. I started over. I started this group called Room to Read. And this book, the goal is to be much more the story of we, to use much more first-person plural, to talk about how we've built an organization by opening ourselves up as an open-source movement so that anybody in the world who wants to get involved with us, anybody in the world who says no more wrong place, wrong time, can indeed get involved with us. This is the story of how we scaled way beyond my wildest dreams. This book actually starts, chapter 1, takes place at the inauguration ceremony for our 10,000th library. It's 2010. We're back in Nepal. I'm with Dinesh, my co-founder. My parents are with me. My mother's holding my hand. It's her 79th birthday. Not every 79-year-old would want to go to Nepal and trek for several days for her birthday, but my mom indeed did. And I'm looking at this inauguration banner saying, congratulations, Room to Read, on the opening of your 10,000th library. And part of me is thinking, like, how the hell did this happen? Because we opened our first library in that village over yonder 10 years ago, about 35 kilometers away, and here we are at 10,000. And that's really the point of departure for this book of, how the heck did that happen? How do you wake up one day and be at 10,000, and then how do you wake up a couple years later and realize that you're at 15,000 libraries? And so I wanted to tell that story not just for the sake of people who are fans of Room to Read, but for the sake of anybody who's passionate about social change. Whether your issue is cancer research, or whether it's the rights of the abused, or whether it's the homeless, or whether it's animal rescue, or whether it's domestic literacy, whatever it is, I've tried to codify in this book every lesson I've learned, every mistake I've made. Not every mistake is in here, but that'll be the third book, which we'll charge more money for. But I tried to codify a lot of the mistakes we've made along the way and a lot of the lessons we've learned along the way. So my hope is that anybody who's passionate about social change can read this book and just basically borrow our intellectual property to say, okay, Room to Read did this really well, let's emulate it. Room to Read did this badly and made a mistake and learn from it. Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's learn from their mistakes. The book also for me became, a little bit of a love letter to my parents. And this is rather ironic because my mother has always been the source of storytelling for me. How many of you ever hang up with your mom and call your friends and oh my God, you wouldn't believe my mother just said to me. Mothers tend to say really interesting things. And in the first book, I talk about my mother and father talking, and my father was saying something about wanting to go to Nepal with me, and I was trying to talk my dad out of going to Nepal with me because I just like to travel alone, travel light, travel fast. And my father kept pushing me on wanting to go to Nepal with me, and I remember my mother saying to him, she calls him Woody, Robert Wood, and she goes, Woody, you're barking up the wrong dog. And I'm like, Mom, it's tree. She goes, what do you mean? I go, it's barking up the wrong tree. Nobody barks up the wrong dog. The dog barks up the wrong tree. And she looks at me and she goes, your father knows what I'm saying. Well, in this book, as we open at the opening of the 10,000th library, my parents are there. And my mother is chit-chatting away. We're about to go cut the red ribbon. And she goes, well, John, I want you to take a picture of your father and I in front of the dedication plaque. And I said, okay. And she goes, well, you take it with your BlackBerry so we can send it to Lindsay and Greg, who are my sister's kids. And she goes, they're really excited to get photos from us. And I said, yeah. And she goes, yeah, they're going to post all the photos you send them to their MyFace page. I'm like, to what? Their MyFace page. And I go, Mom, there's Facebook, which everybody uses, and there's MySpace, which nobody uses, but there's no such thing as MyFace. And she goes, that's what I said, my face. Now stop arguing with me and take our picture. So it became rather ironic. My mom, I think, forgives me for telling these stories about her. But one of the things I really talk about in the book is the power of education to change lives. I think it's something that we can probably take for granted too much. Many of you in this room may have a parent or a grandparent who grew up in poverty. And almost all of us who've gotten out of poverty have a story that involves education. In my father's case, he was one of 7 children who grew up in poverty. His father had a second-grade education, and he was not going to go anywhere in life like his siblings. But at a certain point in life, at age 19, he was given a college scholarship, and he went through and he became a civil engineer. And that was our family's ticket to the middle class. And with the middle class came all those accoutrements you get if you're born in the lucky country or one of the other lucky countries. You get a good public school, you get a government that can afford to pay teachers, you have a school library, you may even have a community library or the beautiful library like you have here just around the corner in Victoria. You're born in the right place at the right time. My parents always tried to stress to me that you were born in the right place at the right time, but now you have to earn your way. If you make a lot of money, that does not make you a good person. And I remember when I was in 8th grade, I used to bring home, we had Scholastic, one of our biggest children's publishers, would give us these book order forms to take home, and I would check off 15 books I wanted to read. And my parents would say, we can't afford that many books. You're going to have to pick and choose. You're going to have to choose 3 or choose 4. And I'd say, well, I want to read all these books. And my parents thankfully found a solution with very high return on investment. For my 8th birthday, they bought me a bicycle and said, you can ride your bike. The library is about 1.5 miles away from our home. They said, you can ride your bike to the library every single week. Well, in this book, I talk about that library. I grew up in a small town in post-industrial Pennsylvania where there was not a lot of intellectual ferment going on. And I guarantee you there's no equivalent of the Wheele Centr in the place where I grew up. But what we did have was this magical library built in 1892. And anybody who wanted to, regardless of their financial status or their religion or their gender or what kind of family they were born into, could walk through those doors. And once you walked through the doors of that library, you were equal. You were equal to anybody, and it was just up to you to make your own way. I talk in the book about my first time at that library when I brought about 15 books up to the desk to check them out. I was excited. I was going to put them in my basket and ride home and read all afternoon. And the librarian said to me, well, you can't take that many books. And I said, why not? And she said, well, we have a limit. You can only check out 8 books. And I don't know if I knew the word arbitrary at age 8, but I was kind of like, that's so arbitrary. Why? I can read more books than that. And thankfully, the librarian and I did a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge deal. And she let me have a secret limit of 12 books. I could take 12 books home per week. And it was really that library and that bicycle that really changed my life forever. It was the fact that I had an educated mother. How many of you have a mother who's educated? Yeah, the majority of you. And I can see you in the back, so don't worry. If you raise your hand, I'll see you. So think about this for a second, the fact that in the world today, with 780 million illiterate people, 2/3 of them are girls and women. And if this doesn't change, then nothing changes. If we don't educate girls and women, we don't educate the next generation. And I think about that a lot because I talk in the book about all these girls Room to Read supporting now through our long-term girls education program, giving these girls academic scholarships, but bolting onto it things they need, their own bicycle, their own life skills coaching, their own homework helping, their own mentoring. I talk in the book, how many of you have traveled in Laos? About 15, 20, 25 of you probably. One of the poorest countries in Asia, and actually one of the poorest countries in the world. I talk in the book about a little girl I've learned about named Inkem. Inkem is one of 20,000 plus girls who go to school every single day with Room to Read support. Inkem's story is one of my favorites because her parents are both mute. And think about for a second how hard it is to live in a place like Laos where the average family is living on $1 a day. I mean, pull a gold coin out of your pocket or your purse and think about what if that was all you had to survive for a day? And with that, you had to buy food, clothing, shelter, medicine. There's nothing left over for the luxury, quote unquote, of an education. Well, Inkem's parents were pressuring her to drop out of school because if you're mute in a country like that, you have pretty much nothing you can do besides be a farmer. Well, Inkem had this spark in her eye, but her parents were telling her she had to drop out of school because they couldn't afford it. Thankfully, her auntie, who has a voice, it turns out her auntie's voice was very, very loud. Her auntie's voice found the ears of one of our Room to Read social mobilizers in Laos. And she pitched them on saying, Inkem is smart, she's bright, she loves to read, she wants to be first in her class, but she's going to have to drop out. And so the social mobilizer came and interviewed Inkem, kind of talked to her family as much as you can talk to people who are mute to try to learn about the family situation. And there was definitely desperate need, and there was a real spark in Inkem's eye. Well, Inkem reported back later, after she had gotten the scholarship, how nervous she was. And then she tried to talk herself out of being successful. She said, I said to myself, these people will never pick me for an academic scholarship. I am from a poor family. My parents are mute. My parents are farmers. My parents have no education. Those people are from the city. I live in the country. Why would they ever pick somebody like me for a scholarship? So she basically talked herself out of being successful. And then one day the news arrived. She'd been chosen as one of about 4,000 girls Room to Read was entering into the program that year. She was excited. She was dancing. She was screaming. Her parents were beaming. They knew immediately what had happened. And what I loved most about that, I actually called this chapter A Kilogram of Gold. Because her auntie said when the family learned that Inkem had been chosen and that you had guaranteed her she would stay in school to the end of secondary school, we felt as though we had won a kilogram of gold. Think about this for a second. To support a girl like Inkem in the developing world is $250 per girl per year. A kilogram of gold is worth $50,000. So think about the difference there, that what costs us $250 is valued by someone in rural Laos or post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia or in Nepal as being the equivalent of $50,000, a kilogram of gold, 200x the amount of money. And I talk about this story in the book because I think sometimes people think the solutions to global poverty are really complex, or they're out of reach, or there's nothing we can do. The reality is there's a lot we can do because those Inkems out there are waiting for us. The families, the aunties out there are waiting for us. They want their kids to go to school. They want their sons to get educated and literate. They want their daughters to get educated and literate. I tell a story in the book about being in Nepal in 2007, talking to Rima Shrestha, our Girls Scholarship Program Officer. Rima told us in our whole group, we had an investor group there, how excited she had been that year. Because in January, she'd gotten her budget approved. And she'd gotten her budget approved to add 500 girls to the program. We all know if you've been to Nepal, it's a tough place to be a boy or a man, but it's definitely a tough place to be a girl. Rima was excited, 500 girls. So she put the word out to our network of NGO partners and government partners and said, we have 500 slots available. Within a month, we had 4,000 girls apply to the program. And Rima said, do you know what it feels like, John, to turn away 3,500 girls and tell them, no, you're not going to get in. You're just going to be one more generation to remain unempowered and underconfident because of education. And I'll not forget Susan Lodge from our Tokyo fundraising chapter. One of our top chapters was there. And she said, Rima, I feel like I have failed you. You should not be in the business of saying no. You should be in the business of saying yes. This is an important issue, I think, because I think sometimes people think that the solution to poverty is something intractable and unreachable, but it's not. It's education. You can look back in your family, 1 or 2 generations, I'm guessing most of you can see where education made the difference. And in the developing world, money goes 100 times as far. So it doesn't take much at all. One of my favorite things in this book that I wrote about, how many of you grew up with Dr. Seuss books? About 2/3 of you. How many of you have read the Harry Potter series yourself? Or read it with a child or a niece or a nephew or whatever it might be. I talk in this book, there's a chapter I wrote called Searching for Seuss. And it was all about our quest to bring books in the mother tongue to kids all across the developing world. When I started Room to Read, I probably will admit that I was a little bit naive. We were sourcing English language books, donating them to schools and building libraries in Nepal and Vietnam and Cambodia, later India. But most of the books we were deploying were English language books. That was the stuff that was easiest to find. We, of course, wanted to do books in Khmer, Vietnamese, Nepalese, but you couldn't find books written for children in those languages. You might be able to find some textbooks that were very thick and text-intensive and black and white with no pictures. They didn't really make learning fun. But you couldn't find the equivalent of Dr. Seuss or the equivalent of J.K. Rowling in these countries. And that seems kind of crazy, right? Doesn't every child deserve to have books in their mother tongue? Well, the reality is, some of you can probably guess why. The for-profit publishers do not publish books in languages spoken by predominantly poor people. There's no incentive to produce books in Lao because Income's parents can't afford books in Lao and Income's auntie and uncle can't afford books in Lao. So if you're a for-profit publisher, you don't publish in those languages. You don't publish in Zulu, Xhosa, Setswana, Tamil, Sinhalese, Chhattisgarhi, Rajasthani, Nepalese, Bangala. Stop me, because it's a depressingly long list of languages where publishers do not publish. But if you think about the supply chain of poverty for a minute, doesn't so much of it go back to whether a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old gets literate? Doesn't a lot of it go back to whether or not a child develops a habit of reading at a young age? So by putting English language books into the libraries, we were admittedly putting the cart before the horse. We needed to have books in the mother tongue. We knew that, but I tell a story in the book where I learned that through a very data-driven process, because we're very, very data-driven at Room to Read. We believe that what gets measured gets done. And so we did a survey in 2004. We went out and we asked the customers, we asked the little people, how are we doing? First graders, second graders, third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, across Vietnam, across Nepal. What would cause you to use the library more often, we asked? Open at night? Open on weekends? Solar lighting? What would it be? Number one answer kids gave us was more books in Nepalese, more books in Vietnamese. That was their number one demand. And there was something for me about, as an ex-business person, looking at that number of 52%, and it's almost like that number should have been flashing, flashing red. Because what it told us is that over half our customers were telling us we suck, right? We're not delivering to them the number one thing they want. Now, if an airline hears that the number one route that's not being covered is a route to city X, they're going to add a route. But there's no profit incentive in doing this. So we looked at that and said, okay, we've got to cross the Rubicon here, and we've got to become a publisher. So we basically decided we'd become a publisher starting in Nepal. We'd do a pilot program. We got seed funding from Jeff Skoll, the founding president of eBay, a man who dares to take risks, which we wish that more foundations dared to take some risks now and then, as opposed to doing the same old year after year after year. And Dinesh, our country director for Nepal, we said, Dinesh, let's produce 10 books. Local language, local author, local artist, original content. A lot of the experts told us we wouldn't be able to get it done. A lot of the experts told us, well, just go ahead and just take an existing book that exists in the West and just superimpose Vietnamese script or superimpose Khmer script on it. And I said, yeah, but that's not going to really be a long-term solution because the kids are not going to see a book that's culturally relevant. And you're going to have kids in Zambia reading a book about the white Christmas with the caroling and the eggnog and the snowflakes around the fireplace, and it's just not going to make any sense to them. So we've got to be able to find a way to produce books. We've got to go searching for Seuss. Well, thankfully, Dinesh found a group called the Nepali Society for Children's Literature. We don't know what the hell they've been doing all those years. They had not been producing much children's literature. But he put the word out, we were going to pay $400 to the author, $400 to the artist, and produce original children's literature. Within a month, we had 67 manuscript submissions. All these authors and all these artists who had ideas for children's books. And Dinesh and the team said, where have you been all this time? And they turned it around and they said, nobody has ever asked. Nobody's ever asked. The books that were produced were absolutely amazing. One of the first books we produced was called Tommy Tempo. If anyone's ever been on a tuk-tuk in Bangkok or in South Asia or in India, in Nepal they call them tempos, not tuk-tuks. But Tommy Tempo, let's call him Tommy the Tuk-Tuk, was one of the first books that was produced. And he's kind of this anthropomorphic tuk-tuk. He's got eyes and he's got, these big smile on his face, but he's a total hell-raising tuk-tuk. So he screams around the already chaotic streets of Kathmandu, running through mud puddles, splashing people and stealing the hats off police officers and stealing their billy clubs and, just kind of causing havoc. And eventually he realized that he shouldn't have run away from his owner, and if, like many children's stories, there's a moral at the end. But these stories started being produced and we started realizing that we were beginning to find the Dr. Seuss of the developing world. We found them in Nepal. We started to find them in Vietnam. We started to find them in Cambodia. The beautiful thing about this program is, number one, it's only $1 per book to produce a children's book in the developing world, printing locally. Again, like the Girls' Education Program, it is not a complex problem. It is not a complex, overly expensive proposition to solve this at $1 per book, or $1,000 equals 1,000 books, or 10,000 equals 10,000. I talk in the book about finding these kids all of a sudden who would come forward in their Room to Read libraries, and these students were saying to our Room to Read staff, we want to write books. We have ideas. We want to illustrate. We want to author books. So the local team started doing these young writer competitions. And one of my favorite stories, Searching for Seuss, in this book, the chapter Searching for Seuss, is about the problem. And the next chapter is called Baby Fish Goes to School. And Baby Fish Goes to School is about the solution. It is a book conceived, written, and illustrated by two Sri Lankan teenage girls. And the story of Baby Fish Goes to School is very, very simple. There's a little baby fish. And it's swimming through the pond. And one day it looks up and it sees all these animals walking by the pond. Indeed, they're actually kind of jogging by the pond. They're very excited. The chicken, the horse, the pig, and the baby fish says, where are you guys going? Oh, we're going to school. The pig says, we love it there. And the chicken says, we sing songs, we play games, we love our teacher, we take naps, we eat curry for lunch. Baby fish says, wow, that's fantastic. I want to go to school. That sounds great. Goes and says to its mother that night, Mom, I'm excited. Tomorrow I'm going to go to school. Mother says, no, you're not. Why not? Because you're a fish, and the school's on land. And baby fish is like, whoa, that totally bites. That's a loose translation from the Sinhalese. But the baby fish, and this is, of course, a story of exclusion. But thankfully, the animals in the book, like a lot of us at Room to Read, are action-oriented optimists. The animals go out, and can anybody just yell out, guess what they buy? I was going to wait for somebody to say they buy a device that drains the pond. No. Yeah, who said it? They buy a fishbowl, right? They buy a fishbowl, and the animals come in the next day, and they scoop baby fish up, and they have a very happy parade, and they take baby fish to school, and they plunk it down, and voila, baby fish goes to school. This was two teenage Sri Lankan girls who came up with this idea, and we're now working to actually get this book published in North America, because we think that every kid around the world should read the story of baby fish. In a certain sense, at Room to Read, I kind of think of us as a giant fishbowl, right? Because what we're doing is we're scooping kids up and saying this solution is not complex, it's not expensive, it's immediately deployable, and it's actually deployable at scale, right? If you need 1 million fish bowls, you can probably go find 1 million fish bowls. And I like the story a lot because really, if you think about it, it's so arbitrary if you're born a fish and the school's on land. But isn't that the situation in the world today? If you're born in Australia or New Zealand or France or Holland, you're pretty lucky. If you're born in South Africa post-apartheid, or if you're born in Tanzania in a rural area, you got a lot of strikes against you, and you're probably not going to get to where you need to go. So Babyfish goes to school. Now, how do we find these authors and artists? How do we find the communities to work with that are very, very motivated? Well, one of the key things I try to talk about in this book is our incredible country directors. Our country directors and their teams are the most important part of Room to Read. We don't believe in the model of sending American expats overseas to drive around in shiny Land Rovers and boss the local people around. Historically, that has not worked very well. Historically, it's not worked at all. What we want to do is hire very motivated, bright Cambodians in Cambodia, Lao people in Laos, Sri Lankans in Sri Lanka. I tell the story in the book about Mr. Chris Matupi, our country director for South Africa. Chris and I could not have more different backgrounds. Today we're perfectly in sync. We're perfectly united in the idea of bringing education to kids everywhere who have lost the lottery of life. Chris, like me, is 49 years old. But he grew up as a black kid under apartheid in rural South Africa, so he did not have the same advantages that I had. When I first met Chris, he told me all about his upbringing, and I want to just read a little something from the book here, where Chris says to me when I first meet him, he says, "My name is Chris Matupi. Matupi, in my language, means warrior. But the only weapon this warrior had was education." And he talked about how much education meant to him. And I just want to read you a brief excerpt from my first time I sat down and had lunch with Chris Matupi. I write, "Despite the raw deal he's gotten in life, Chris does not seem to have a negative bone in his body. I want to learn more about him, so we booked time to have a quiet lunch together. But with Chris, nothing is ever really quiet. He loves to tell stories. Over the next 2 hours, I sit back and let his personal biography wash over me. Growing up black in South Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, he said, pretty much guaranteed you were poor. I lived in a rural village with my grandparents. My father left the family when I was 3, and my mother went into the city to find work, working as a housekeeper for a white family. Her visits home were infrequent, but my gran and my gramps took good care of me. I was surrounded by a lot of love, but it was difficult for them to take me in, as they were already living on the edge. The food that had barely fed 2 of them was now divided into 3 parts, so every day I'd go to school hungry. During lunchtime, as the other kids gathered to eat the food they had brought, I would hide in a field behind the school building. I did not want the other children to know that I could not afford lunch. I was ashamed. But I still went to school every day. I knew that I had to study and get good grades. I knew that I had to read as much as I could. Only by understanding how the world works could I hope to find my place in it. And then one day at lunchtime, I noticed there was another student who was also behind the school. I recognized him. He was smart. He was always one of the top 2 students. Chris then looked at me and smiled and said, I, of course, was always the other one. Chris said, quote, why was this other boy also behind his school in the outhouses? Because he couldn't afford to eat either. But we told ourselves that we were as good as everyone else in our class, because on the one thing that could be objectively measured, our grades, we always came out on top. A driven personality, Chris was not content to rest in those laurels. He would tell me about everything he told me about everything he would do, everything in his power, he said, to read as many books as he could get his eager young hands on. I asked him how this was possible. If his grandparents were too poor to afford a meager lunch for him, how could they buy books? They could not, he said. Perhaps, I ventured. Did your school have a really good library? Again, Chris shook his head with a forlorn look that wordlessly mouthed, if only. Then how did you do it, Chris? I asked him. I understand your love of books. I grew up with it too. But I was lucky. Chris laughed. You, John, were lucky. But I was innovative. And Chris talked about the 2 or 3 times a year he got to go to the city to visit his mother. And what he would do is wait for Thursday nights. It was his favorite night of the week. Why? Because he said it was garbage night. Garbage night, I asked? Yes, he said. After dark, I would sneak around the neighborhood, going from dustbin to dustbin, knowing that some would have books in them. Those white people sure had long driveways, he chuckled. The house was far enough away that they couldn't see a young black man digging through their garbage. I don't know what they would have thought if they had seen me. But John, I couldn't believe that white people would throw away books and magazines and newspapers. It was inconceivable to me that something as valuable as a book could be making a one-way journey to the dump. So every time I came home with 5 or 10 books and sat down to read them. I think about the lottery of life, and myself growing up with a mother who could read to me and a grandmother who could read to me and a father who was there and a public school and a public library and a school library. And I think about that same young man growing up under apartheid in South Africa and how random life can be. But I never lose heart because the Chris Matubies of the world are out there ready to invest in their own solution. The Incomes and her auntie and uncle who are out there are looking for us to help them, but they're willing to help themselves. I tell this story in the book later about Chris taking his first job, working for a man who owned a roofing business, mostly kind of repairing and a lot of tarring of roofs. Chris talked about the fact that he started working with this guy at age 15, and the man always had to figure out how to price his competitive bids. Price it too low, you don't make any money. Price it too high, you don't win the business, your competitor undercuts you. Well, the guy knew how to multiply X times Y. That was area. That's how he quoted his business. And then one day they got a big new job. But it was for a building that was round. And X times Y didn't work. And Chris's boss was totally flummoxed. Didn't know what to do. And Chris looked at him, said, pi r squared. Chris said, when I gave him the solution and we won the bid, and he gave me a bonus for helping him to figure this out, he said, I knew that I would always have a job and I'd always be successful in life because I'd gotten educated at a young age. So there's a story of an autodidact. What I also love about Chris is that as an educated black South African who's multilingual, he could work for a public company or a private company and probably make 5 times what we're paying him. But he chooses because he believes the same way that Nelson Mandela said, if you want to help South Africa post-apartheid, don't give us aid. Help us to educate our children and we'll be independent within a decade. A couple more stories. I've got about 8 more minutes, so I'm going to tell you a few more stories from the book. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a bummer story, and then I'll close on 2 highlights. Okay? I won't try to be too much of a Debbie Downer, but this chapter is called "Whose Version of the Future Will Win." The chapter opens as I confront a rather flaky billionaire as the global financial crisis enters its 2nd week. This flaky billionaire had given us a $5 million pledge and said, grow, grow, grow. Grow the number of employees, grow the number of communities you tell you can build schools in, crank up those printing presses, get a lot more girls in school. My family's going to give you a $5 million grant. You can just grow, grow, grow. We were excited, so we hired and we said yes to communities and more communities. We got all these girls lined up to say, when the school year starts, we're going to be with you. And then the GFC hit. And this flaky billionaire came to our office and said, well, times have changed. I can't give you the $5 million. We said, yeah, we watch the financial news. We know what's going on. So what can you do? What's our haircut going to be? And he said, it's 100%. It's zero. I'm giving you nothing. My family's net worth has dropped by 30%. And being a bit of a smart ass, I said, well, so what? You were worth $1.5 billion and now you're worth like $1.1 billion? So don't punish the children. But she did. She withdrew the pledge. And then 2 days later, we had another funder withdraw a $3 million pledge. So all of a sudden, we're staring at $8 million gap. So we started talking about what girls would we say goodbye to, and what employees would we fire, and what schools would we cancel, and what libraries would we not open that year. And I was uttered a sentence that night after the second withdrawn pledge where I had never said before, I'm too depressed to run. I couldn't go running. And I went to my local coffee shop instead to lick my wounds. And it got worse as I sat down to lick my wounds because I decided to read the New York Times. And the story I ran across was a story about acid attacks against girls in Pakistan. And there was another story that they referenced online that I could link to that talked about acid attacks in Bangladesh against girls. And if there's ever anything that could be more horrific than the misogyny and the violence and this violation of human rights that come with acid attacks, I can't think of anything worse. So my just self-worth was at an all-time low after this last week I'd had. And the acid attacks to me were really actually very motivating because I thought about all those girls we were thinking about kicking out of the program or not getting into the program that year and all the schools and libraries we were going to not build. And I think it's really important that boys go to school along girls so that boys learn that girls are just like them human beings. We can all live side by side. So I pulled my journal out and I wrote a letter. It was a letter to those perpetrators of the acid attacks, But in a certain sense, it was also a letter to myself, to tell myself, buck up, Skipper. Stop whinging. Get out there and change things. Don't let this set you down. But let me read you the letter that I wrote. I never mailed it. I didn't need to. The letter was related to myself, but I addressed it to the terrorists. Dear bastards, I read about your cowardly act. Do you really want to keep alive a set of beliefs that come straight out of the 8th century and do so in a barbaric way? You want to tell little girls that they don't belong in school? Well, guess what? Our team is going to engage you in battle on this issue. We are going to send the exact opposite message, and we plan to use a much louder megaphone. With every fiber of my being, I vow that Roomtreed will embrace young girls around the world. We will tell them that we believe in them, that we will support them, and that they belong in school, and that they will stay in school. We will do this not just today or this year, but every single day until that glorious moment when they become the first member of their family to complete secondary school. Inaction in the face of tyranny is nothing short of cowardice. Reading about your despicable acts convinces me to oppose you. One of the immutable laws of physics is that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So here's my vow, my response. My team and I will work harder than ever to convince people everywhere in the world to join in this battle. If I have to personally fund those girls' scholars in Bangladesh, all 200 of them, I will do so. Nothing could make me happier than writing that check. The financing mechanism is unimportant. What matters most is this. We will oppose you 24/7. Make no mistake. Our team is larger, our team is smarter, and we will win. Thank you. When I wrote that letter at the beginning of the global financial crisis, we had 7,000 girls in the program. Today, we have over 20,000. We've tripled it during the GFC. And at Room to Read, we say when the going gets tough, or when we actually say we're going to GSD our way through the GFC. GSD means get shit done. So when we hear GFC, we don't hear GFC. We hear GSD. Let's get more and more done. Let me close with one final story, a story that I love, and it's a story that's very uplifting, as it talks about how empowered these villages are that we work with. When we build schools and libraries, we do not go in and build it for the local people. We build with them. We're not the sole investor, we're co-investors. The government co-invests, the people co-invest through what we call sweat equity. They donate labor, they donate land, they donate small amounts of money to each project. Throughout the developing world, I think there's too many of these things called aid drops, where well-meaning people come in and do things for the local people. Drop surplus grain, dump a bunch of shoes, dump surplus t-shirts, but the local merchants then cannot compete against free or heavily subsidized. The local people we work with, and we're now up to over 16,500 villages where we have open Room to Read schools or libraries. And I want to point out, I talk a lot in this book about the importance of girls, but I also want to point out we're not anti-boy. As a former boy myself, I would never want to be accused of being anti-boy. Half of those who benefit from Room to Read projects are boys, and half are girls. So that's an important thing. But I talk in this book about being in Zambia 2 summers ago and meeting a librarian named Agnes. She had over 1,000 students accessing the library we had helped the village to build using community labor. And Agnes was showing us the library, saying that she came to school every day an hour early and stayed an hour late. She was a teacher, but she wanted to run the library for an hour before school and an hour after the school so it could stay open longer. And I said, Agnes, how can you do that? You're already teaching a full day. And she said, John, I'm a teacher, and it always saddened me that we did not have books for our students. Now we do. I love this library, she said. And when you love something, you must do it with all of your heart and all of your energy and all of your passion. And that just for me filled me with the energy to say, I've got to get out and get more funds raised and more media attention for our work so that we can help more of these Agneses around the world. But Agnes wasn't thinking that. She was already continuing to tour. Agnes said, John, you must come back now behind the library. I said, behind the library, why? She goes, to see the piggery. I said, to see the piggery. She said, yes, we have a piggery at the school. Let me show it to you. We walked back, and I couldn't figure it out. And Samantha, our country director, said, don't worry, she'll explain it to you. Got out back, and we could hear the grunting from inside the piggery. 2 males, 4 females, doing what pigs do best, right? They're making bacon back there. And I said, why do you get to a piggery? And she said, well, we constructed a school. We had materials left over. We decided that we'd build a piggery, and the teachers all funded the purchase of pigs. And they sold off the piglets. What do you do with the money? We fund scholarships for HIV/AIDS orphans. They had funded 30 scholarships for HIV/AIDS orphans because they had the foresight to produce a piggery and start selling the piglets. And I love that story, and I'll close in that story because If we had designed that solution in the ivory tower and declared every village must have a piggery, they'd be like, what are you talking about? That's absolutely crazy. Nobody would implement that idea. But the solutions are out there throughout the developing world. And I will give a shout out to the fact that many times, if not probably most times, they're low tech. Sometimes there's a bias, especially in the technology world that I come from, and that some of you work in, to think that we need to have E this and E that and blah, blah, blah. And we're in villages that don't even have electricity, let alone being on the grid. But like the fishbowl, like the piggery, like giving Income's family enough money to get her to go to school every day, oftentimes the solutions are low tech, they're low cost, they are absolutely infinitely scalable, and we can get a lot more done. 7.8 million kids now benefit from Room to Read. My hope is that this book propels us to the next milestone, 10 million by 2015. We hope that many of you will join our amazing Melbourne chapter and help drive us to the next limit. My hope is that in 5 years, the numbers in this book will also look small. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I was just wondering if you were able, just really quickly, to detail your experience of negotiating with governments of these countries. I mean, especially, you definitely may find governments that are willing to participate, but then, of course, they themselves have budgeting issues. What have been some of your experiences with negotiating them, as you were saying before, that you're a co-investor, because, of course, it's really important to get the governments on side. Thank you.
I think the most important thing for us in talking to governments is it's not me going in as a American guy talking to the governments. It's done by our local teams. It's the negotiation taking place at a local level. And we actually challenge the governments. We say, we're not going to make it easy for you because we're actually going to challenge you to put money into each project. The government has to pay the teachers. The government's going to pay the librarians. And so in a certain sense, it acts as an anti-corruption device because we tell the governments, you can't ask us for money. We're going to be asking you for money. And then the community has to be motivated to actually invest and co-invest in their own solution. So we're not for every government. If the government's corrupt or lazy, they may not want us. But the good news is it's a self-selection mechanism. We're only going to select those governments and those communities that are motivated and want to invest in their own solution. We believe very much that you can't help people if they don't want to help themselves. Now the good news is at a provincial level and a country level, we have a long list of governments that are asking us to come in. Paul Kagame in Rwanda has sent word to me through an intermediary that if we decide to bring Room to Read to Rwanda, he will appoint a government minister to be our personal valet or concierge who will help us to get started. I met with the Indonesian ambassador to the U.S. last month and presented our credentials. He said, we need Room to Read in Indonesia. I will brief the president. I will take a letter from him to you. We need this in Indonesia. We have too many problems with kids who are illiterate and who are not reading. So the good news is we have a long list of governments that want to work with us. It's not always easy because we do tell the governments we're going to not only challenge you to put money in each project, we're also going to monitor it and measure it. And if you don't perform, we'll leave. And this is great in a sense because we tell the governments, we can't want this more than you want it. So last year in South Africa, I'll give an example, the Eastern Cape province was not meeting the things, the obligations. So we said, okay, you know what? Mpumalanga province is performing. We're going to take some of your budget and put it in Mpumalanga unless you improve. They didn't improve. We said, great, the rest of your budget's going to go to Limpopo, and we're going to work there. So I think the key thing is to try really hard to get these things to work, but you can't push a piece of string uphill. The good news is that Eastern Cape example is extremely rare. What we typically find is the governments and the ministries deliver so well on their promises that we then try to figure out how to double and then how to triple our impact in that area, because together we can do a lot more. There's a longer, more complex, nuanced answer in the book, including the stuff we've screwed up.
Hi, John. My name's Rebecca. I got involved with Room to Read after you spoke at the Wheele Centr last time you were in Melbourne. I just wanted you to speak about how much it costs to build a library and how much it costs to build a school, because it's really cheap and I think people need to hear it.
Yeah, definitely. There's two types of libraries. There's the library in the school that's overcrowded, where they have to build a separate building. The building might be about half the size of this room, and that costs about 20,000 Aus dollars to build the building using community labor, which brings your costs down. Put in the desks, the chairs, the bookshelves, the child-friendly flooring, fill it with books, and support it for its first 3 years. That's only 20,000 Aus dollars. And that also has dedication rights. So if you want to just circumvent this whole process of being one of the 5 winners, It's really easy to do. You can get a bunch of coworkers together tomorrow and say, let's just divide it in 5 and get it done, GSD. The classroom libraries, where the schools can actually give us a room to kit out and build a library in, those are only $5,000. Now think about that for a second. The average library serves 400 children. So for $12.50 per child, the price of probably a wine by the glass, you're impacting that many kids, 400 kids for $5,000. And then the school construction varies. That runs from $35,000 for a 4-room school to about $50,000 for a 6-room school. And I'll tell you a quick story, because one of the things I do in this book is I talk about marketing a lot. I'm a former Microsoft guy, so we're really good at marketing and some stuff. I tell stories in the book about how charities can use marketing and branding and things to get a lot more done. And I'll tell you a quick story from 2 weeks ago in Hong Kong, our annual wine gala. At the end of the evening, I get up and I say to people, I'm not asking you to fund a trip to buy a trip to Bali or to buy that nice Hermes bag. I'm asking you to just put your paddle in the air to fund a school at $35,000, fund a library at $5,000, whatever it might be. And it's a bit of a tightrope walk, because you don't know if people are going to put their paddles in the air or not. There's about 350 people in the room. And this year we did a special deal. We went to Moet Hennessy, which is a partner of ours, and we convinced them that as I announced that if you raised your paddle and funded a school, they would give you 6 bottles of 2003 Dom Perignon to celebrate. This is a great partnership between a company and Room to Read. People got excited, a little fizzy. We got 25 schools funded in less than a minute, thanks to that offer. We said, we're going on to Singapore. Let's do something similar in Singapore. Come on, Moet Hennessy. And they said, sure, what the hell? You guys are a pain in the butt. We'll do it anyway. Fine, we'll do it again. And we got 10 schools funded in a minute. Friday night in Sydney, doing it again. Moe's going to be there, and we're doing it again in April in Tokyo. We already have Friday night in Sydney. We already have 3 people who have pre-committed to doing schools. And I don't think they're doing it because they get the fizz of the Dom Perignon, but it's not a bad side benefit.
I've kind of got 2 questions. Sorry.
Can you only ask just the better of the 2? Because there's a lot of people with their hands up, and we just want to be able to give them a chance.
I just wanted to ask, what sort of infrastructural challenges did you face with building your first library in Nepal?
Lack of yaks. We needed more yaks. We had so many books. No, I'm kidding. I wouldn't say there were any infrastructure challenges. The biggest thing was just lack of books in the local language, because we were filling the libraries with English language books, and kids were not literate in their mother tongue, let alone in English. That was really the biggest challenge. The second biggest challenge we had was just demand exceeded supply. The minute we started opening libraries, what would happen is those headmasters would walk by a school on their way from one place to another in the mountains, stop by, see the school, see the library, and they'd say, I want one of those too. And that's happened to us now. Even though we opened last year, believe it or not, we opened 2,000 libraries last year alone. That's 6 new libraries a day. That's a new library every 4 hours opening around the world last year. We opened libraries faster than Starbucks opened outlets when they were 12 years old. They opened 1,000 outlets in their 12th year, post-IPO. We opened 2,000 outlets. Even though we're opening outlets faster than Starbucks, we still have a backlog as long as my arm of communities that want us, that need us. And every day we lose is a day we don't get back. So I encourage everybody to get involved with us, because 1 every 4 hours is great, but wouldn't it be cool if it was 1 every 3 hours, every 2? There's a lot more we can do. I think we have time for about 2 more, and I'll let the people with the microphone make the decision and be unpopular if they don't choose one of you.
Yep. Hello, Anthony Garnham. I work with the Beacon Foundation. I think we're one of 200,000 not-for-profit organisations in Australia trying to make a big difference. And something sitting here and listening to you that's really grabbed me is the fact, the simplicity of your program, but also the simplicity of your name. And I'm interested to know, with your marketing hat on, how critical has the simplicity of your name been to your success, in your view?
No, that's a great question. So the simplicity of the name Room to Read. Well, I'll tell you. One of the mistakes I made was when I first started the organization. I had a very simple name for it. I called it Books for Nepal. Talk about a name that was not going to help you scale, right? And my poor co-founder, Aaron, who had done work for Unilever in Vietnam, went and presented our credentials to the Vietnamese government and said, we want to bring the program to Vietnam and fund scholarships for girls and build schools. And the Vietnamese ministry was saying, but your name is Books for Nepal. Why are you bringing us to Vietnam? And we realized we had to come up with a new name. I think often the charity world is where bad brands go to die. You ask people what they do, and they say, I do this, and you can't remember the name, and it's this long acronym that has 6 letters, and it stands for something, blah, blah, and you just don't remember it. So I think the name Room to Read has helped a lot. The problem with brands is that, like the old song goes about girlfriends, that all the good ones are taken. In the world, a lot of the good brands are taken. So in the first book, Leaving Microsoft, I talk about having a dinner party with friends who worked at Google and who worked at Microsoft and who worked at Yahoo, and over several bottles of wine, we came up with all these names. We're going to change the name from Books for Nepal. We're going to call it, the International Literacy Project, which sounds like so UN bureaucratic, it's ridiculous. And then I came up with the idea of calling it Books Ahoy, because you could picture the books going to sea. And one of my friends who worked at Google was like, that's the worst name ever. And we kept third bottle of wine, and kept going. At one point I said, I go, Room to Read, RTR. It's alliterative. It's 424. It's metaphorical, it's aspirational, room to read. And my friend Paul, who worked at Google, said there is no way in the world that name will be available. I said, well, go find out. So he grabbed his laptop, he looked it up, and sure enough, roomtoread.org was available. So he quickly grabbed it, and then he tried to sell it to me for 3 times the price he'd paid for it. But I think it's really important. It's kind of like this book, right? We call this book Creating Room to Read. And my editor at Penguin said she loved it. She said, it says what it means, and it means what it says. And I think we need more of that in the nonprofit world, not just branding, but also transparency. Being honest, posting your evaluations on your website, not posting 1 year of financials, posting 3 or 4 or 5, or in our case, 6 years of financials, posting your annual reports, doing everything you can, not just to be simple, but a lot of stuff is complex, but really being open with your donors. We post all of our evaluations on our website, warts and all. Right? When we get those evaluations, we're not like Dick Cheney in the basement of the White House at midnight blacklining out the bad parts. We're posting the website to say to the world, you can see what we do, and you can see what the evaluators tell us. Where are we strong? Where are we weak? And then what's our response? What's our plan to get better in those areas where we're weak? So I'm sorry, I gave you a long answer to a short question, but I often do that. We have time for like 2 more. Yeah? Okay. Hi.
John, I work in East Timor as a volunteer in literacy, and I'd like to ask you, in a country like that that's been occupied for over 500 years, and where your teachers don't even know what a book is and have not seen a children's book, do not understand the excitement of a book, the world that it opens up to the children, I fail to see how you can find the authors and the illustrators within the country without first bringing in books to actually expose them to them.
No, that's a good point. We do that. When we run our writing workshops, if we're going to a new country and we're running workshops for the writers, the authors, the artists, we just flood the zone with quality children's literature from all over. But the key thing is we don't just bring books from America. We bring our self-published books from Cambodia, from South Africa, where we publish in all 11 official languages. We bring in people to actually do artist workshops. But what's interesting about it, we call it training, but what actually happens is they train each other. You leave those creative people alone for 2 or 3 days, and you give them a bunch of books and paper and crayons and paint, and they go crazy in a good way, teaching each other. But I think every teacher everywhere, once they see the children responding to books, I think it's just inherent. I think it's just up here. I think it's something that we're born with, that it's just obvious that when a child sees a brightly colored children's book for the first time and connects with it, it's just a magical moment of kinetic energy. And it's certainly, for me, that first moment in Nepal of watching those 450 kids diving on these brightly colored children's books before, that moment ultimately cost me millions of dollars, because it forced me to walk away from my job and examine, what am I doing with my life? I'm making rich people richer. But what the good news is now, I didn't mention with Babyfish Goes to School, we now have 850 original titles we produced using local authors and local artists, producing 10,000 copies minimum of each of those books. That's gotten us to over 12.5 million books deployed. And by the end of this year, we're going to hit another milestone. The last milestone is our 15,000th library. By the end of this year, we're going to publish our 1,000th original children's title. So I often say that room to read, thank you. I often say that Room to Read is the biggest children's publisher you've never heard of, because we're doing it in these really overlooked languages. I've been told we have time for one more.
Hi, John. My name's Gilda, and I haven't heard you mention any countries in South America or Central America, and I was just wondering if that's a region that you're looking to enter?
Definitely. Watch this space. I mean, I think for me what's really, it's both sad and motivating, is that this work we do is needed everywhere, right? Your friend in the same row working in East Timor. You're asking about Central and South America. People ask me today, what about Pakistan? What about Indonesia? What about Myanmar? Right? These issues, it just frustrates the hell out of me that we haven't solved these issues, because this stuff is needed everywhere in the world. So the challenge for us is we don't launch a country until we can actually go in at scale, because a lot of NGOs go in and do a onesie, a twosie, and then it's kind of over. And what we want to look at is how can we reach 100 villages, 500 villages, 1,000 villages. But we are looking very closely at Central America and South America. I'll just give you a quick synopsis of where we are with that. The good news for us is that in the last year, Credit Suisse, the big bank, which is very, very big in Indonesia, has said to us, we want to see Room to Read in Indonesia. They've been supporting us now for 7 years. We want to see Room to Read in Indonesia. And for the first time ever, a private bank has agreed to do the fundraising round for us. So all these really highly paid bankers are not on our payroll, but they're off pitching their Indonesian clients to say, come on, you made a lot of money. Now let's help rural Indonesia help those kids. So they're committed to raising a $5 million seed round for Indonesia. That's really exciting. And the head of Credit Suisse Brazil, which is the second biggest or first biggest, depending on which league tables you look at in Brazil, has told us that when we actually finish the Indonesia round, Credit Suisse Brazil will lead a round for Brazil. Wealthy Brazilians saying, come on, you guys are making a lot of money. Your company's making a lot of money. Let's do something for the kids in the rural, in the north and the northeast. We would use that then as hopefully, ideally, our beachhead to then go into more parts of South America and Central America. I'm mentoring a young woman now who comes from Colombia, and she's so passionate. We had drinks in Houston a few weeks ago, and she and her husband, for their wedding, they did not ask for did not ask for presents. They asked for books, because they are establishing a library off the coast of Colombia, right off Cartagena. And it's going to be their first library. And she said, I'm going to be the Room to Read of Colombia. And what excites me is there's so many young social entrepreneurs these days who are starting the equivalent of Room to Read, whether it be in Myanmar, where I've donated some books to them, whether it be in Afghanistan. I think people realize everywhere, without literacy, without education, without habit of reading, without great teachers, and without gender equality in education, nothing changes. So what I'll tell you is short term, and I guess I'll close on this, short term, our goal is to reach our 10 millionth child by the end of 2015. When I started Room to Read, I believed that bold goals attract bold people. I said 10 million kids by 2020. I was told that was a crazy hubristic goal that we'd never hit. The good news is we're going to arrive there 5 years early. We're going to reach our 10 millionth kid by 2015. If this book does well, and I hope all of you will do your part in helping this book to do well, we could potentially reach more than 10 million kids by 2015. But beyond that, we want to be in more than 10 countries. Indonesia will be number 11. We're watching Myanmar very, very closely. But beyond that, when people say to me, okay, you're 13 years in, what's the real long-term goal? Again, I'll go back to what I said at the very, very beginning. I'll come just like I did with the Wheele Centr. I'll come full circle. Longer term, the goal is very simple. It's to say no child should ever be told again, you were born in the wrong place, at the wrong time, to the wrong family, and you therefore did not get education. We believe that idea belongs in a scrap heap of human history, and we believe that with all of you working with us, hopefully, in our Melbourne chapter, in our Sydney chapter, in our Perth, in our Brisbane chapter, in our Canberra chapter, we can make that whole notion history and tell every child you were born in the right place, at the right time, because we were there for you. Now it's your turn. Read, 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 children. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.